So I hope all of you are enjoying the conference so far. I definitely am. We've been presented a great deal about the history of the Landmarks Law in New York and its practice by the Commission. And we've also been greatly informed by an expert panel's discussion of how preservation is practiced in other cities and municipalities throughout the United States. It is now my pleasure to introduce an impressive leader in conservation, planning, and urban design in India, someone who brings an international perspective to the dialogue and who will speak on a topic in which I have a deep personal interest and connection. Rahul Maharashtra is one of the foremost practicing architects and educators. He works in Mumbai and teaches at the Graduate School of Design at Harvard University, where he's a professor of urban design as well as a member of the steering committee of Harvard South Asia Initiative. His practice, RMA Architects, have executed a range of projects across India. These diverse projects have engaged many issues, multiple constituencies, and varying scales, from interior design and architecture to urban design, conservation, and planning. Some of his major initiatives have included the site management plan for the Taj Mahal, which is a joint venture between the Archaeological Survey of India and the Tata Group. And he's also been involved and spearheaded the restoration of Mahala and Faluknuma palaces in Hyderabad. He has written and co-authored and edited a vast repertoire of books on Mumbai, its urban history, its historic buildings, public spaces, and planning processes. He currently serves on the governing boards of the London School of Economics, City Program, and the Indian Institute of Human Settlements. Please join me in the welcoming Rahul Maharashtra to discuss conservation in India.
Thank you, Meenakshi, for those very kind words. I think I should put this up a bit. Thank you. So good afternoon. Thank you, Meenakshi. Thank you, Gerald, for this wonderful invitation. It's been great listening to everything being discussed this morning. An amazing experience, I must sort of confess. I'm also happy that I'm following the presentation on Detroit because I'm also not a preservationist, and I come from the same kind of perspective that Maurice sort of brought to this conference. Detroit, like Mumbai, I think is an extreme example, and I think there's a lot to learn from these extreme conditions, and I think Mumbai is one of those, and I think as we get more globalized, these conditions catch up with us across the globe. And so what I'm going to do with you is share my experiences in Mumbai. I'm going to sort of spend a few minutes on our legislation and institutional structures. And then I'm going to sort of share with you observations, perhaps you could call them theoretical underpinnings, but which might complicate the debate or begin to ask other questions which might, I think, be productive, and then show you one example of something that we've done. In India, we have our monuments preserved, conserved, protected by the Archaeological Survey of India, which is a central body. This is something the British instituted, and they cover 6,000 monuments, which are generally isolated. I mean, the Taj Mahal would be one such monument that the Archaeological Survey of India protects. But at the level of our cities, the legislation has been more recent. It was only 1995. The process started. For me, this building was emblematic of the process of preservation or the landmarks sort of movement starting in India. This is the Small Causes Court, and as the judges who are sort of appointed for life grew older and they needed an elevator, the Public Works Department that is charged with looking after the building in the spirit of the directness of modernism added an elevator on this facade, which freaked everyone out in the city. And groups of people, civil society, NGOs, someone who really led the charge was a man called Shyam Chainani. The Indian Heritage Society, Intact, NGOs generally began compiling a list of buildings and compiled about 600 buildings and were lobbying for legislation to protect these. But obviously, it's hard to just take a list of buildings and legislate it without sort of a broader imagination of the city. In 1999, I, sort of having studied urban design, arrived in Mumbai and started working with these groups and realized that unless we moved into the questions of zoning and urban conservation, it was going to be hard to write legislation. And so the discussion moved in that direction. And this was really a confluence of people on the ground who were interested in conservation, but also, I suppose, bringing the dimension of sort of situating these questions in the broader context of the city that resulted in legislation being instituted in 1995, much inspired by both the English model, but also the model of New York in terms of zoning. It's a very robust legislation which includes the protection of trees, milestones, statues, 650 buildings, and that number is growing. I think it's about 1,000 now. And the current sort of effort in the city is to use that legislation to begin to now protect 20th century architecture. The way it's sort of regulated is that the municipal corporation has a heritage committee, which is headed by an ex-municipal commissioner. It's an advisory committee, which means technically the municipal commissioner can turn down the advice of the committee. And the committee is represented, again, across civil society with historians, architects, engineers, and others. So it's sort of a pretty standard piece. It has grade 1, grade 2, grade 3, which is, again, the British system. But it's a robust piece of legislation. This is 1995. But what I think was important about the legislation was that we managed to, besides the building, also designate about 14 districts, of which the historic Fort District, which is the old fortified area the British had established, became one of these 14 districts and the largest one. And of course, within this, you have grade 1, grade 2, grade 3 buildings, but you also have open spaces which are designated to be protected, also graded. So for example, those 4 large open spaces, which are the Maidans, are all grade 1 in their designation and in their protection. So it's quite robust. We also have height control. I mean, so it's all the regular sort of instruments that, we've sort of picked up from around the world and sort of applied. So, but what does that mean, when we take legislation which is rather universalizing in some ways and apply it to a complicated context like India? I mean, somebody brought up the question of religious structures, and there was a classic case with these sort of listings of a Jain temple, which was listed, and when the Heritage Committee sort of showed up when they were altering it, I mean, the priests, the trustees, they made an argument that actually the only way they can reinforce and express their faith was to rebuild this, because across the street another temple had been rebuilt, and that was a way of demonstrating faith. So what does conservation mean? So in the practice of conservation, I use the word conservation because I see it more broadly. I don't see it as static. Preservation implies a kind of static notion, whereas this is part of a broader ecology, like the conservation of our natural habitat. It's always changing, and similarly, I think one has to imagine it in those ways. So in the practice in India, it's not really easy to distinguish between conservation, preservation, restoration, reconstruction, and even contemporary formulations. Besides the obvious reasons of living craft traditions that facilitate repair, preservation, reconstruction, and perhaps as authentically as norms might demand, it is the coexistence of many times where skills, practices, approaches, and values from different centuries are simultaneously alive. And this is an aspect that one can't ignore or escape. In India, for example, in Hindi, the word kal means both yesterday and tomorrow. The past and the future are often viewed simultaneously in our perception. In fact, even today, a number of heritage buildings in India are actively used for worship by contemporary society, and they're not even treated as isolated dead monuments. So this continuous nature of uses and the notion of cultural traditions evolving into each other over time most often blurs the distinctions that are otherwise made in Western traditions defined by specific time periods. In this respect, the Indian examples are most specifically the urban Indian condition relates much more relevantly to the situations implied by the Nara document on authenticity of 1994, where conservation professionals from around the world questioned some of the assumptions about authenticity found in earlier international charters. The charter and its follow-up discussions emphasized developing greater understanding of the values represented by the cultural properties themselves, as well as respecting the role such monuments and sites play in contemporary society. suggesting that significance itself evolves. So this idea of evolving significance takes on a critical dimension when contemplating preservation of the built environment or conservation of the built environment, creation of new artifacts, etc. So then how does the conservationist grapple with significance or meaning? In fact, the notion of cultural significance is something that emerged in the conservation debate in the 80s, in the Borough Charter to be more specific. And it is, but in that definition, it is an object-centric definition, something that's devoid of life, with its roots perhaps in the debates propagated by the antiquarians of the Renaissance. The interesting question is how one deals with this idea or notion in a highly pluralistic society where hybridity is on the move and where cultural memory is often an enacted process, or where meanings are not stable, but in fact fluid. And it is here that accepting cultural significance evolves is something that will truly clarify the role of the professional, the architect, the conservationist, as an advocate of change versus one who opposes change, one who can engage with both these conditions on equal terms and blur their obvious binaries, perhaps to create new hybrid formulations in ways this sort of notion of simultaneous validity is engaged with. So the architect and conservationist then would slip back and forth between the role of a planner, the role of a conservationist or a preservationist in the pure sense, and a designer who sees the possibilities in ways space may be used, therefore reinterpreted. And I think this is very critical as a way and an approach in a context like India. So in India, you see this image here of a temple tank. The temples are not sacred, but the tank with a thumb, which symbolizes the churning of the ocean and the creation of the world, is the sacred kind of piece of that ensemble. J.B. Jackson, the incredibly incisive landscape architect and commentator, he said that ancient societies like Hinduism, the Aboriginal people, for example, they are concerned and obsessed with the moment of the original creation of the cosmic plan, so to speak. And their symbolism is sort of related to that, and that becomes very sacred in those cultures. Newer religions like Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, they are concerned with a covenant between man and the Almighty and the circumstance of that covenant and the artifacts that begin to symbolize that. And so the building becomes incredibly critical. And so therefore the obsession with the building as an artifact that creates or that contains the symbolism of that covenant between man and the Almighty. So these are fundamental differences in the way a society collectively decides what's culturally important and not. And now in a post-colonial situation like in the one in Mumbai, this gets even more complicated because the custodians of this environment, which is us Indians, are different in culture from the creators, which were the British. And so if we begin to use the narratives of English heritage, which is the narratives of the creators, then it just doesn't work in that society. So this becomes another incredibly complicated disjuncture. And it's a very uncomfortable relationship with these artifacts. We all dwell in the postcard city as preservationists because those narratives of a golden moment is often much more powerful. But if you look at the reality of the cultural landscape in which this is situated, it's quite different. How is Mumbai made? Mumbai is on the ground made by incremental moves. This is a diagram that I use called the 5 stages of squatting, which explains how my city grows. It grows in these little increments, and over a year this sort of begins to become a city in a sense, or entire neighborhoods. Or, for example, I was fascinated recently. This is Dharavi, which is Asia's largest slum. Slumdog Millionaire, movies like that have celebrated it. Jeb Bergman from the University of Michigan made an amazing case for declaring this a World Heritage Site because he showed that all the norms of the United Nations World Heritage Site criteria fit Dharavi, equivalent to Havana, Quito, Prague. He talked about, an important interchange of human values, outstanding example of traditional human settlements. I mean, he took all the criteria and applied it to Dharavi. But it's a completely different aesthetic because we imagine preservation to be artifacts, buildings, monumental, which are static. Here, urbanism in a condition like India is an elastic condition. It's not about grand vision, but it's about grand adjustment. My friend Gerald Caden has made me very aware of privatized public space in Mumbai. These are our cricket fields. This is this wonderful game of cricket. It's this Indian game of cricket which the British invented. And these are maidans where they play cricket, but in the evenings they're venues for weddings, which wrap around. And look at the cricket pitches not touched because that's sacred ground. This is privatized public space. In the morning, it's back to a cricket field. It happens for 12 hours. Also, the spectacle of our cities is not architecture. It's festivals like this great Ganesh festival, where on the last day, this 300 idols of that size are immersed. Here, immersion becomes a metaphor for the spectacle of the city, because as the clay idol dissolves in the water of the bay, the spectacle comes to a close. There are no static or permanent mechanisms to encode the spectacle. Here, the memory of the city is an enacted process, a temporal moment, as opposed to buildings that contain the public memory as static or permanent entities. Within this kinetic city, as I call it, meanings are not stable. Spaces get consumed, reinterpreted, and recycled. This transformative ability plays itself out here in our Grade 1 building. This is the town hall, where the British governor spoke to the citizens every year, once a year. After our independence, we decided to keep that tradition going. And so the governor had to pick a day to speak to the citizens, and they spoke Independence Day, which is the 15th of August, in the thick of the monsoon. So the challenge for the Public Works Department is to get the governor up 34 steps without getting him or her wet. Of course, if you gave it to our five-star hotels, they'd get two strapping Sikhs wearing turbans, using umbrellas, and parading the governor up with bugles. But the Public Works Department has other ideas. And what they do is they create this sort of a temporary canopy. The conservationists in the city go berserk. There are letters to the editor. People protest. This is a Grade 1 building. This is sacrilege. But for me, it's fantastic. It's a reversible moment. This happens again for 10 hours. They tie this canopy up with coir ropes. They don't damage the building. It's reversed in the morning. It's back to normal. It's elastic. So it, again, meets these norms. So, I mean, I think one has to be open to many other ways of looking at this. And so our historic district, it has listed buildings. Of course, we use these norms, but actually nothing happened on the ground. And so we began to work with how we might actually, make something effective on the ground. So we began to ask the question, what is the contemporary engine by which one might be able to drive the conservation process on the ground? Because the legislation comes out of narratives which mean nothing to the people on the ground in a post-colonial situation. And so we kind of reinvented the designations and looked at character, and we came up with these districts. The purple is the art district, the tourist district in red, the yellow is a banking district, corporate district, the open spaces, civic centers. We began to give character to this, asking what might be the contemporary engines that drive the process of conservation. I'm just going to show you one, which is the purple, the art district. So here, this is an example, and we've actually worked on all of these, formed groups and associations, got lawyers to register them, got the charity commissioner to give us exemptions from tax so that they can kind of operate, and their agenda is the conservation. And so we managed to band people together who would be interested in the idea of conservation, but also invented a significance. And for the architect, it becomes very hard because you walk a really fine line. You're inventing a significance for the space to create a contemporary engine to drive it, but you're also interested in keeping the architectural illusion intact. And so this becomes actually even harder than just working down the linear path of pure significance. And so we converted this into an art district. We whitewashed a building for $100 as a starting point. That got everyone very interested. It was about signage, about changing people's perceptions. We invented a festival, lit up buildings, everything in the public realm, because this whole process was from ground up. It wasn't from top down. And so the idea was to animate public space first as a way of engaging people through this new narrative of use of the area. Interstitial spaces became places for children, for children's activities, because they were safe. So the facades got converted into galleries. We got owners to let their facades be used by artists to sell paintings. We got India's most famous artist, Hussain, to paint this horse, because the area is called Kala Ghoda, which means black horse, from a statue that existed there. This was auctioned to raise money. pavement galleries were set up. The parking lot and civic improvement was carried out by the money that we generated, which became spaces for art on weekends, signage, street furniture, things that our government has very low on their priority, rightly so. And then from that money, we actually restored the Grade 1 buildings, and this is a local architect called Abha Narayan. For me, it was great. I was only 35 when I was doing this, but I was a client to these architects, so it was a very early kind of part of my career, but it was nice to engage architects. So Abha Narayan, who's a well-known conservation architect, conserved this Grade 1 building, which was the first time that an MOU had been done between the state government, the Public Works Department, and the association of this area in terms of a public-private partnership. And so this is the museum, which sits in the center of this sort of space, and you can see the museum has a large warehouse, which is on the right there, which was 50,000 square feet with only one entrance, and then it meant that we could also make contemporary interventions here to open up that 50,000 square feet. So we designed a veranda space that would connect that space so that you had 50,000 square feet more. So it's also about contemporary interventions. We recently did a visitor center, which became a threshold between the museum and the art district because of security, and this was a contemporary building that could be dismantled if another generation felt they wanted a more conservative approach in terms of an intervention. So it animated this large area, and this has got many sub-areas with Art Deco buildings, a wonderful array of architecture. But I just showed you one example, which was about trying to evolve significance in productive ways to connect with the cultural landscape on which you're sort of operating. And now, of course, we formed a management, we've created a management plan, we've created an association of all the different districts, so now we are beginning to do the top-down, having done the ground-up at many levels. And so we are talking about pedestrianization, we've started a hop-on, hop-off bus, which the government has actually started now, so there are 8 buses that take you around the district with the idea that if this is popular, we can get into pedestrianization. We're looking at parking. We're getting into kind of the micro-planning strategies, which will be now top-down strategies, having built a base and a constituency on the ground. So I'm just going to end with these couple of questions. Again, alluding to Rem Koolhaas's, I've sort of picked this up from that, where he talked about how monuments to cultural landscapes. Over the years, we've broadened our gamut, and he provocatively asks us why we are not listing the landing site of Apollo 11 on the moon. I mean, that should be kind of the natural extension of our ambitions. But this, for me, is very important, which is that the moment between an act and the artifact that's being protected is really collapsing very rapidly. And so by 1960, we were looking at conserving things that were only 10 years old. Today, we will be conserving things that are being built, and you could provocatively ask that perhaps in the future, when you go for building permission, someone will decide whether the building should be conserved in the future or not. So you will decide on preserving something before it's built, if you follow the logic of this argument. But I think for me, that's extremely interesting, because finally, I think conservation, preservation is but one instrument of planning. And projective preservation or projective conservation will truly be planning, and that's when I think these two won't be silos, will become one again. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rahul, and also the esteemed panelists who are here this morning. I know that the afternoon session will be equally lively, and I'd like to jumpstart with just a few thoughts. I don't really consider myself provocative, even though some of my friends think I am, but my co-sponsors and I truly want to encourage a conversation that will challenge us intellectually and maybe even philosophically. The first afternoon session, moderated by Vicki Wiener, is on preservation and planning. The Commission has come a long way from the initial list of several hundred buildings that the pre-law Commission identified. One does wonder what the drafters of the law, who created a mostly volunteer commission, could have envisioned that 50 years later we would have designated over 33,000 buildings, or designated approximately 27% of Manhattan buildings, or that the Commission would be regulating many of the most significant commercial areas of the borough, such as Madison Avenue, Soho, Ladies Mile, or Columbus Avenue. As we look at the past, it is safe to assume that after 50 years of success, preservation, with all its benefits, and despite some grumblings, is an integral part of public policy and here to stay. So as we look towards the future, is it time for preservation to be considered and advanced not only through its own independent lens or through environmental review, but as a critical planning objective where governments and administrations establish blueprints for the future? Undoubtedly, there are many challenges ahead, including population growth, affordable housing, infrastructure and transportation, community services, environmental concerns, and rising sea levels. There are overarching global objectives that each city should embrace and implement, including addressing inequality, shelter, public health and safety, sustainability, and resiliency. These challenges and objectives will place significant strains on the city, and the reality is that the practice of historic preservation within this context will have to acknowledge and adapt to them. I've heard many times about the uneasy tension, the tenuous alliance, and the necessary independence between planning for the city and preserving for the city. As a planner, I'm sometimes surprised that this notion may still be held today. When I was at city planning and directing the initiative to ultimately resolve the nettlesome issue of the historic Broadway Theater's air rights, the district-wide transfer inherently promoted both the preservation of a unique collection of historic buildings, as well as the long-term retention of the theater use. The landmarking of the theaters itself emerged from the loss of two historic theaters in the late 1970s, and during the planning process of shifting density to the west side of Midtown in 1982. In fact, city planning and landmarks were both involved in creating a wider mechanism in 1998, and as a result, land use and preservation objectives were achieved. The Landmarks Law was born out of a movement that raised awareness of how important historic, architectural, and cultural structures are to the evolution of cities and regions. This concept is in our zeitgeist, as Gerald said earlier on, and firmly embedded in today's thinking. Planning itself has been influenced by both the successes of the Landmarks Law and the shift from top-down planning to a more nuanced, democratic, and inclusive participatory process. It would seem that the days of the Robert Moses-type massive transportation proposals barreling through the established neighborhoods of Greenwich Village and Soho, threats to the essence of historic preservation, are very much behind us, and probably, at least in New York, will not dare rear its ugly head again. Planning ideals have changed over the past 50 years as well. Changes to the zoning code since 1961 itself sheds light on such philosophical shifts, where contextual zoning and special districts aim to address unique characteristics in neighborhoods and the urban environment, contrasting with the principle of ubiquitous towers in the park or urban renewal, a vision articulated when the 61 Code was adopted. As in any issue that we as a society face, we are confronted with making choices, and planning for preservation will require choices as well. But does this necessarily undermine the goals of preservation? Perhaps there's a fear that preservation may lose out to social goals. That fear might be antiquated, however, as preservation advocates can draw immense strength over the past 50 years, where designations in historic districts have helped create the most desirable residential neighborhoods, the most thriving commercial hubs, the most visited buildings, and the most recognizable icons that symbolize the city internationally. So given that historic preservation is an established public good, and the planning process itself has evolved, should we develop a better model or institutionalize a better process at the outset for integrating preservation and planning? The second panel this afternoon will explore preservation in the future and will be moderated by my co-sponsor, Gerald Caden. There are fascinating and complex problems and issues that the Landmarks Preservation Commission will face, both at a micro level as well as a macro level. With the Commission having designated over 33,000 properties, there's the regulatory responsibility to review more than 13,000 applications a year, over 500 of which come before a volunteer commission. With the additional designations every year, the number of applications will increase. To what extent should a volunteer commission be placed with this regulatory responsibility, and what may very well develop as a full-time function? And does it make more sense for the commission to be compensated similar to the City Planning Commission or the Board of Standards and Appeals? And I've again heard so much about the independence of the commission by being a volunteer commission, but it does raise a fascinating dilemma. Alternatively, should we question the regulatory scheme itself and its associated responsibilities? Whether the standards adopted are successful in preserving what New Yorkers want, what preservation advocates expect, and what property owners think are important? Is there a tension between what people want and expect from preservation and what preservation advocates want? And is the practice of law responsible for that tension? In trying to address the regulatory scheme, questions come up. Should all historic structures be treated alike? Does this binary approach of certificates of no effect and of appropriateness limit or curtail the Commission's ability to safeguard different variety of buildings? Is the law too blunt, where the Commission's discretion is limited to the physical, historic, and aesthetic? Or, as we've heard today, should there be a system of projects of special merit? By the same token, is the current binary scheme of categorizing buildings as contributing and non-contributing buildings still valid? Or the LPC code of style and no style? And is it able to address the variety of buildings and their varying degrees of importance and significance? For example, cultural landmarks with little architectural attributes. How best should we manage expectations of communities, advocates, property owners, and the public about the level of change and preservation in districts and of individual structures? At a broader level, should historic districts be conceived as representative of a special sense of place of a larger area, or should the Commission strive to designate all the buildings that are arguably create a special sense of place? And are most people interested in preserving the scale and predictability of their neighborhoods, or the architectural and historic qualities? And in the future, should the Commission's focus be on younger buildings that represent eras of development not yet designated? Finally, is the incremental approach to designations the only vision for the future, or should we find a strategy to ensure future designations, particularly in an environment of rapid change? And we've heard a little bit about that in the approach that Los Angeles has taken, which I thought was very fascinating. In other words, should we engage in creating a new vision for the future or a long-term plan for designating the city? I'd like to stress that this conference is intended to be a safe haven for exploring answers to these and other questions, particularly knowing that the law's strength and its might can clearly withstand some rigorous debate. So I really do look forward to the two sessions that we have before us, and thank you all very much.